Today, 18th August, I think it's probably fair to say that the advance of the Russian army in Donbass, specifically towards Pokrovsk and Selidovo, is finally stirring growing alarm in the West, and the advance in Toretsk apparently has not been noticed so much, but it seems to be at least as dramatic, whilst the Western reporting is now showing increasing signs of skepticism about the conflict, about the Ukrainian incursion in Kursk region. Even the British media is now starting to be slightly more skeptical about it than it previously was. Having said which, let's turn to the overall situation and let's discuss what's actually going on. The first thing to say is that yesterday the media was full of stories, the Russian media was full of stories about possible Ukrainian strikes against the Kursk and Zaporozhye nuclear power plants. Over the course of yesterday, after I made my video, we started to get reports of heated denials from Ukraine that they had any plans to carry out any attacks of that nature whatsoever. The Russians invited Mr. Grossi, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, to visit the Kursk nuclear power plant. I'm not sure whether he has accepted this invitation and is in fact going there. And well, there's been reports, including from the IAEA, of noises of battle, some distance from the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, but no actual information that any kind of missile strike on either of the two power plants, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant or the Kursk nuclear power plant, has actually taken place. Later, over the course of the day, the Russian Foreign Ministry also weighed in with a warning of dire consequences for Ukraine if it launched an attack on the Kursk nuclear power plant. Specifically, it was written in very similar terms to the previous warning given by the Russian Defense Ministry. Anyway, it's important to say that there has, as of yet, been no sign of an attack on either nuclear power plant, and for what it is worth, Russian commentary about this, on this topic, over the last couple of hours has abated. Maybe plans to launch a missile strike or some kind of missile strike on either of these two power plants actually existed, and that the Russian warnings deterred them. Maybe the Russians have been in contact with the Western powers and Western governments, as they have previously, responded by telling Kiev that attacks on either nuclear power plant would be unacceptable and were a red line for the West as well. And maybe the Ukrainians decided to pull back. Maybe the Ukrainians are just biding their time. Their preparations haven't yet been completed, and attacks on the power plants will take place at some point over the next couple of days or weeks. Or maybe the Ukrainians never had those plans in the first place. As I pointed out yesterday, the Russian comments, the official Russian comments from the Defense Ministry, and by the way also from the Foreign Ministry, appeared to distance the Russian authorities themselves from the information that an attack on either power station was being prepared by Ukraine. The Russians merely said that they were getting this information from independent sources. In other words, from the Russian media. So maybe there was never a plan in the first place, and maybe the whole story that was blown up yesterday had no actual truth to it. One can never be completely sure, because the fact is that the Ukrainians have conducted attacks specifically on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and the Russians say that some months ago they also attempted a sabotage attempt on the Kursk nuclear power plant. So it may be that there were these plans. But I have to make one observation, which is that at one level, there are some difficulties in understanding the logic of an attack specifically on the Kursk nuclear power plant. If Ukraine had succeeded in capturing the Kursk nuclear power plant, which, as I've said, can have been the only objective that Ukraine had in launching its operation in Kursk, well, that would have been an important event. The Ukrainians would have had the nuclear power plant under their control. It would have been an asset that they could have bargained with to try to extract concessions from the Russians. It would have attracted a huge amount of international opinion, and it would have created a crisis in Moscow. But attacking the nuclear power plant, creating a nuclear accident there, I don't understand what Ukraine would actually achieve by doing that. Obviously, there would be a major crisis. There would perhaps be an evacuation of the city of Kursk, which would be very troubling for the Russians, to put it mildly. But what actually would Ukraine achieve by doing that, other than to create some disturbance for the Russians? The Russians would quickly get the nuclear power station back under control. They would probably insist that in order to allow a relief effort around the nuclear power station, the Ukrainians withdraw completely from Kursk region to allow the emergency services untrammeled access to the nuclear power station, or at least they would demand that the Ukrainians cease military operations near the nuclear power station. Probably they would get a lot of Western support, or at least a lot of international support to do that. Maybe not so much from the West, but certainly from the rest of the world. And since everybody would believe, despite whatever the Ukrainians pretended, that it had been the Ukrainians that launched the attack on the Kursk nuclear power station, it would only work to their massive international disadvantage. It would confirm for most of the world that Ukraine is a country that is led by irresponsible and reckless adventurers, prepared to take the most incredible gambles and willing to act in the most cynical and disastrous way. Whatever remaining credit Ukraine has with the international community outside the West would almost certainly evaporate. Needless to say, an event of that kind would not cause the Russians to end their conflict, the conflict in Ukraine. On the contrary, it would almost certainly make the Russians even more determined to persist with it. And Putin and his government would be able to say that the attack on the Kursk nuclear power station, proves that Russia cannot live peacefully with a neighboring country, led by people like that. So I cannot see myself the logic of this act, and for that reason, I wonder whether the Russians perhaps weren't playing up this story a little yesterday, because they want to remind everybody. The Western media has been recently downplaying the fact that the original objective that Ukraine had set was the seizure of the nuclear power station. There were some hints to this effect in some of the articles that initially appeared, but they've gradually melted away as it's become clear that the nuclear power plant itself simply cannot be reached. Anyway, it could be that the Russians stirred up the story about the nuclear power plants, the attacks on the nuclear power plants in Zaporozhye, in Kursk, intentionally with a view to reminding everybody that the original objective of the Ukrainians was to capture the nuclear power plant and to basically bring the Kursk nuclear power plant back into the mainframe of the story. That's just a thought. I don't know whether this is so. Let me repeat again, with the Ukrainians, with the present leadership in Ukraine, it is never very easy to predict what they will do because they act so often in ways that, at least to me, seem completely illogical. And the Kursk operation is a case in point. Now, I discussed the military aspects of the Kursk operation at great detail, but since I made my program yesterday, I've been thinking further about that story in the Washington Post, which, by the way, has not been denied either by Russia or Ukraine, that Russia and Ukraine were on the brink of an agreement mediated by the Emir of Qatar, whereby each side agreed to stop further missile and drone strikes on the other's energy system. And I pointed out yesterday, in my program yesterday, that on its face, this agreement, had it been reached, would have been overwhelmingly in Ukraine's favour. Ukrainian attacks on Russia's energy system have been pinpricks which have made no difference to the overall economic situation in Russia. Hardly any lights have gone out in Russia. Russia's strikes on Ukraine's energy system have completely devastated it. I believe that power generation is now down to about 20% of pre-war levels. Ukraine depends heavily on imports of electricity from the European Union, from Hungary and Slovakia, and even then, assuming those power supplies continue, which cannot be taken for granted, given how bad relations between Ukraine and those two countries now are, well, even then, it is likely that Ukraine will suffer severe power shortages this winter. So, getting an agreement whereby Russia ceases its strikes on Ukraine's energy system would have seemed massively to Ukraine's benefit. In fact, so much so that even allowing for the fact that the Russians probably do not want to annoy the Emir of Qatar, who is a friend, and probably do not want to annoy the BRICS states, I have wondered why the Russians came so close to agreeing to a proposal, a mutual ceasefire in the energy war like this. And the only conclusion that makes sense is that all the talk that we've been hearing over the past few weeks that about negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, about finding some kind of diplomatic process to end the war, was far more advanced than had appeared on the surface. The Russians, Putin, made a speech some weeks ago to the Russian Foreign Ministry in which he said that the condition for a ceasefire was a Ukrainian pullout from the four regions, at which point a ceasefire would immediately take effect, but that for a full peace there would have to be a commitment from Ukraine that it would become a neutral country that would cease to be a member of NATO, and that all of the various other provisions of the Istanbul Agreement be brought into effect. Those are Putin's terms, and from what I can understand, most of the governments around the world that have been seeking to achieve a compromise, or at least to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end, were open to a settlement of the conflict on the basis of what the Russians were proposing. And I wonder whether what happened was that these talks in Qatar about seeking an end to the energy war weren't part of discussions about how to get a substantive negotiation between the Ukrainians and the Russians to end the war underway. Maybe not an immediate full ceasefire, but at least to get the two sides talking to each other once more, with assurances given to the Russians by their various friends, by the Chinese, the Indians, the Qataris, the Saudis, all of the others, that the direction of travel would eventually be a peace agreement similar to the one, perhaps even identical to the one, that Putin outlined in his address to the foreign ministry some weeks ago. In which case, this incursion into Kursk has not only wrecked the discussions for a mutual ceasefire in the energy war, which is what the Washington Post has told us, it is, as Putin has himself said, and as other Russian diplomats have reiterated, it has wrecked the entire movement towards negotiations for a general ceasefire and a settlement of the conflict altogether. Negotiations or discussions towards negotiations, which were, as I said, much more further advanced than I had appreciated. In which case, one can understand the extreme anger about the Kursk incursion evinced by one of the mediating parties, which was China. The Chinese media, as I have said, has been extremely negative about this whole affair. And by the way, it is blaming the United States. It is saying that it is the United States that was behind the Kursk incursion, and it is the United States, therefore, that has again acted to stop a negotiated peace, a negotiated settlement of the conflict from being reached. Well, again, I want to make it clear this is speculation on my part. I don't know whether this is actually the case, but I have difficulty understanding why otherwise the Russians would have agreed a mutual ceasefire in the energy war, as it seems was almost the case, unless they did believe that the war itself was likely coming to an end on their kind of terms. And by the way, various comments made by Mikhailo Podolyak, Zelensky's advisor, about how the seizure of Russian territory in Kursk region is intended to put Ukraine in a better position in negotiations, how Ukraine is not going to beg the Russians for terms, that is going to stand high and negotiate with the Russians on an equal basis and all that. In other words, that Ukraine wants to upturn the entire realities. All of that perhaps also points to the fact that negotiations were within perhaps a few weeks, substantive negotiations to end the war, like the ones we saw in March and April of 2022, were just round the corner. And, well, if all of this is correct, and again, I'm piling on one if upon the other, then the Ukrainians, who are facing a critical situation and who urgently need peace, or so it seems to me, have again acted perhaps without understanding fully what they were doing. They have again acted to wreck negotiations, which would at least have ensured the survival in some form of Ukraine. Maybe a reduced, truncated Ukraine, but a Ukraine nonetheless. And again, it seems so completely contrary to Ukraine's interests at this stage in the war, given that Ukraine is going down and going down fast, that to me, it looks illogical. I ought to say, before anybody makes the point, that of course this has been a perennial problem in my understanding of events. Many people have told me that I take an overly rational view of what people do, and that I'm always surprised when people behave so diametrically opposite to their own interests. But anyway, there we are. Given that the Ukrainians might have wrecked a possible negotiation, which could have at least ensured the survival of their state, and given that the Ukrainians, it seems, have definitely wrecked a ceasefire in the energy war, which was overwhelmingly to their own advantage, how can one say for certain that they're not prepared to cap one folly with all of the others by launching attacks, completely misconceived and misguided attacks on nuclear power stations? I'm not able to say that. As I said, when a party repeatedly acts so entirely contrary to its own interests and in such a reckless and illogical way, I can't say definitely that it's not going to do something equally illogical and perhaps even more dangerous. But anyway, there we go. Now, there is one further point that I must make about this issue of negotiations, assuming that it was true, which is that it is all but inconceivable that Ukraine acted on its own. And the fact that there are factions in Ukraine which perhaps don't want negotiations at all, well, I've discussed that in many programs, and that's well understood. But I get the sense that even as more and more Western governments gradually, very gradually, come round to the understanding that the war in Ukraine cannot be won, that it is almost certainly going to be lost if things continue the way they are, and that for that reason, if for no other, some sort of negotiated outcome is essential. Well, it seems to me that some parties in the West, in the United States, in Britain, in some of the East European countries, Poland, the Baltic states, remain implacably opposed to any negotiations at all. And, well, again, I don't want to finger my own country. I don't think that I have enough evidence to say that Britain might have played a role in encouraging this Kursk incursion in order to stop negotiations, which it doesn't want to see. I'm not able to say that that is what happened. But just consider the few facts which might just possibly mean that it was something like that happened. Firstly, we see British armoured vehicles being used to a very considerable degree in these operations, in this operation in Kursk, which means, of course, that the troops who are engaging in this operation are the troops who were trained by the British, just saying. Note also that the British media, after a short delay, started to talk up this operation for all it was worth. We've had British journalists enter Ukraine Interestingly, the Russians have enter Russia, enter Kursk region, I should say, with the Ukrainian army. The Russians have taken extreme umbrage to the entry into Suja specifically with the Ukrainians of Italian journalists, but they have said almost nothing about the British. Clearly, they have written off the British completely in this respect. But there's something else. We have had an incredibly bitter and angry statement over the last 24 hours about Britain from none other than President Zelensky. He's made comments on Ukrainian television. He, by the way, regularly does. I think he does it on a daily basis. He gives updates about the war. He seems to be furious with the British. He says that the British previously had been amongst Ukraine's strongest supporters, but over the last period, their support has dwindled away. There's a lot of speculation that this is in connection with the British refusal to allow Storm Shadow missiles to be used in attacks on Russian territory, specifically against the Russian airbase at Lipetsk. Apparently, the British are keen to let the Ukrainians do that, but the United States has categorically vetoed it, at least for the time being. Anyway, I wonder whether with the Donbass fronts falling apart and with the offensive in Kursk now basically becoming bogged down with lots of losses, whether one of the parties that was urging Ukraine on to launch an offensive of this kind or to do something to stop the negotiations taking place, the substantive negotiations to achieve peace, might have been Britain, in which case, and again, I want to stress this is pure speculation, I don't know that this is the case, but in which case Britain has acted for the second time in wrecking negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. It did that in April 2022, and perhaps, possibly, it might have done so again. Let me once again say that this is a process of deduction. It is not evidence. I've no information that would confirm that there's been any role, that the British have played any direct role in the Kursk offensive, that they've encouraged it for the purpose that I've said, or for any of these reasons. But, as I said, I do take away the fact, at least at the moment, that some of the troops involved clearly are British trained and British armed, and that Zelensky, for some reason, seems to be very angry with Britain at the moment, feeling that perhaps, again, the British have led him and Ukraine up the primrose path, that they've, to change the metaphor, brought them to a point where they've just abandoned them. I don't know. Anyway, let's wait and see. No doubt in time, maybe years from now, the whole story of the Kursk operation will be provided to us, maybe in some long article in the New Yorker or the New York Times. Maybe we will get the story on the memoir literature. I suspect that there is a very, very complicated story to be told here. All kinds of things going on behind the curtain that we can only guess at but cannot know. And eventually, we will get to the truth. But probably not for some time. Anyway, in the meantime, what is actually going on in Ukraine? Well, the big news, far and away the most important news, is that the Russian breakthroughs in Donbass are continuing, and in fact, we're having a continued acceleration of the Russian advance. Now, again, there tends to be a degree of denial about this in various places, but today the Russian Defense Ministry has told us that another village, Sviridonovka, in the area south of the main road from Mirnograd to Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar, this other village closer to Pokrovsk, has been captured. This is confirmed by the Russian Defense Ministry. There are other reports that put the Russians significantly closer to Pokrovsk than this village, and which talk of more villages in this area, the area around Pokrovsk, having been captured. So that's one report confirmed by the Russian Defense Ministry. But there have been many others, and there appears to be a considerable amount of discussion about what's going on in the area close to Selidovo. Another important logistics hub, much smaller place than Mercouris. It's got about population of about 10,000. There are reports that the Ukrainians are now starting an evacuation of Selidovo as well. Now, over the last few hours, there are lots of reports of a whole series of further advances by the Russians. Firstly, there are reports that the Russians, having captured the village of Zelanye, about which the Russian Defense Ministry has not confirmed, have advanced south and have captured the villages of Novozelanye and Zavitne, immediately to the south of Zelanye. Supposedly, they have surrounded and are close to capturing the village of Komishevka, and that the entire Ukrainian positions south of Zelanye have collapsed, and allegedly this has been confirmed by the Ukrainians themselves. Slightly to the west of these places, as I discussed over the previous 2 days, the Russians are now in secure control of the village of Mykolaievka. And there are reports that the Russians have advanced further, that they've captured the village of Marinivka and another village which is called Mikhailivka. And Mikhailivka is located immediately to the west of Selidovo, to the east rather, of Selidovo. I cannot on a map say how great the distance between Mikhailivka and Selidovo actually is, but I'm going to guess 1 or 2 kilometers. In other words, the Russians are literally now outside Selidovo. And apparently, fighting in Grodivka is continuing. This is the village which is between between Progress, the village of Progress, which the Russians have captured, and Pokrovsk. And the Russians supposedly are advancing in this area too. They're gradually bringing Grodivka under control. It may be that Grodivka will fall either today or over the next couple of days, who's to say? That's what some of the reports, anyway, are suggesting. And in the meantime, it looks as if the Russians not only have definitely captured the 3 villages that I've previously talked about, Orlovka, Zhuravka, Mikhailivka, but they've now captured also Krasny Yar and Kruty Yar, and that they might be close to capturing Mykolaievka, the village to the north, which confusingly is called Mykolaievka also. The Russians capture all of these villages then Grodivka is at risk. The Ukrainian forces in Grodivka are at risk of encirclement. It's a reasonable guess that they'll pull back and that they could withdraw back towards Mirnograd and Pokrovsk, in which case the road to Mirnograd and Pokrovsk is open for the Russians. The other important village which the Russians would presumably want to capture, which is connected to any advance on Selidovo, is Novogrodivka, which is located now between the villages of Orlovka and Martinivka, both of which supposedly the Russians now control. Novogrodivka, as I've said previously, appears to be a Soviet creation with various high-rise buildings there. There are rumours, that the Ukrainians are trying to make a stand in this village. It seems more likely that rather than risk encirclement again, the Ukrainians will pull back from Novogrodivka, in which case the defence positions in Selidovo look extremely precarious, and it is likely that that town will fall. So, the situation in the Pokrovsk area continues to deteriorate. There's no sign of any reduction in the Russian advance towards either Selidovo or Pokrovsk. It's likely that both of these places will fall fairly soon. When I say fairly soon, I'm not talking about tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. It could take several weeks. But anyway, the situation is deteriorating fast. And just to say that with the Russians in control of, apparently, of Mikhailovka, Mikhailovka is located on the road from Mirnograd, the supply road from Mirnograd to Karlovka, which the Ukrainians have been trying to defend. It looks as if supply lines for the Ukrainians to Karlovka, the Ukrainian forces in Karlovka, are now at risk of being cut. I'm going to make a guess that the Ukrainians soon are going to start to withdraw from Karlovka as well. And once they do, and once the Russians have completed the capture of Komishevka, well, in theory, they could continue to push on south from Mikhailovka, which they've just captured, and Karlovka. They could start advancing westwards, and a string of other villages, Memrik, Khaitsinivka, Ukrainsk. There's some reports even that there have been Russian reconnaissance groups have even reached Ukrainsk, that all of these places could start to be threatened, which of course would present massive risks for the Ukrainian forces that are located to the south in Kurakovo. Just saying. So, a very desperate situation for the Ukrainians in western Pokrovsk. Apparently some Ukrainian troops have now been sent to Pokrovsk. I gather they're paratroopers from Ukraine's airborne forces. Very overextended, so I understand. Well, we'll see what they do and whether they're able to slow down the Russians in Pokrovsk. There are reports that the Russian forces around Pokrovsk now outnumber the Ukrainians by a considerable margin, and it may be that the Ukrainians are not going to be able to slow the Russians in Pokrovsk. And it's been suggested that if the Ukrainians are going to concentrate on defending any location, it will probably be Pokrovsk, in which case it could be that Selidovo and Kurakovo will soon be surrendered, and that will anyway force a Ukrainian withdrawal from Vuhledar further south. Whilst I am talking about Kurakovo and Vuhledar, there's been more reports, by the way, from the southern areas. It looks as if the Russians not only have crossed the main road from the main road linking the village of Konstantinovka to Vuhledar itself, but that they are now literally outside, just outside the village of Vodyane. If or when Vodyane is captured by the Russians, the way is open for the Russians to advance further and cut off the one other remaining road to Vuhledar, which is a much smaller road. Vuhledar is then at very, very great risk of being completely encircled. And again, I can't help but think that the Ukrainians are going to pull back completely before long from Vuhledar. So anyway, there we are. A crisis for the Ukrainians in southwestern Donbass, with no sign that it's easing at all in any way. The news from Toretsk over the last couple of hours has, if anything, become even more alarming. And again, this is coming now from apparently Ukrainian sources, because it seems that the Russians may have completed the capture of the high-rise building area in the east of Toretsk, and that they've now launched an attack, a storming operation in Toretsk from the southeast, that Russian forces have advanced from Zaliznya, the two coal mines, in other words, between New York, Zaliznya on the one hand, and Toretsk itself, presumably are under Russian control, and that Russian forces have now broken into the metropolitan area of Toretsk itself, precisely in this area, as well as from the area of the high-rise buildings to the northeast of Toretsk. There's even claims, which are perhaps exaggerated, that this is the final operation to storm Toretsk itself. There's been, interestingly, less news from New York, perhaps because the events in Toretsk are overshadowing what is happening. But to say it simply, if Toretsk falls, well, it would not be as decisive and catastrophic a blow for Ukraine as the fall of Pokrovsk. But it would be a massive blow nonetheless. It would be a disaster. It would almost certainly result in the collapse of Ukrainian defenses in Chasiv Yar. It would enable the Russians to attack the city of the town of Konstantinovka from the south. It would also mean a collapse of the main Ukrainian defense lines, the last part of the defense lines that Ukraine created in Donbass in the 2014-2015 period. It would mean that the entire Ukrainian defense line had now broken. And as we have seen, once the main defense lines are broken, there are no further big defense lines lying behind them that the Ukrainians can fall back on. That's what we've seen with the fighting in Avdiivka, and that's, I suspect, what we would also see in the event that the Russians were to capture Toretsk. The Russians would be able to advance towards Konstantinovka along the main road from Toretsk, all of the area territories to the west, to the east, between Toretsk and basically Bakhmut, would rapidly fall under Russian control, and the Russians would probably, within weeks, be outside Konstantinovka itself from the south, even as they're pressing on Konstantinovka from the northeast in connection with their ongoing advance through Chasiv Yar. So, again, a disastrous situation. And by the way, these Russian advances in Toretsk have also been confirmed from Ukrainian sources. So, a very dismal situation for the Ukrainians there also. Well, in the meantime, of course, the Ukrainians continue their operation in Kursk region. And here I'm going to do again what I normally do. I am going to go and discuss, firstly, what Group of Forces North is telling us. Group of Forces North being, of course, the entity that provides us with most of the, its Group of Forces North is the Russian military grouping that is defending Kursk region and is also seeking to capture Volchansk. And as I've discussed many times, interestingly, they provide rather detailed and rather colourful information about the situation in the territories where they're fighting. And they have given us a fairly interesting account. This time they're providing us with a lot of information about the situation, and well, it tells us that the situation for the Ukrainians, their account of what's going on, again differs markedly from what we're learning from the Ukrainians or what the Ukrainians are telling us, or from what is appearing on the Western media. So let's start. On August 17th, the Group of Forces North continued to carry out tasks to protect the border areas of Kursk and Belgorod regions. Fierce fighting continues in the Korenevo direction. Over 24 hours, we repelled 3 enemy attacks on the settlements of Olgovka and Komarovka, destroying up to 50 Ukrainian armed forces fighters, 1 tank, 5 armoured fighting vehicles. Information about the enemy's presence in the settlement of Korenovo is not true. Now this is interesting because what they are discussing are 2 pincer attacks, are attempts by the Ukrainians to bypass Korenovo from the north through an attack on Olgovka. And notice that this report from Group of Forces North tells us that Olgovka, which many sources claim is under Ukrainian control, is under Russian control. And also from the south, from the village of Komarovka, which all sources acknowledge is under Russian control. Anyway, your Group of Forces North say that up to 50 Ukrainian forces fighters, 1 tank and 5 armoured fighting vehicles were destroyed. What they're not telling us is something that we have actual film of and which is confirmed by all sorts of reporters, reporting channels, the usual media channels. And that is that the southern attack, the one towards Komarovka, was an absolute and complete disaster. Not only were the Ukrainians defeated in Komarovka, but an entire platoon of Ukrainian troops, 24 men, surrendered en masse and were taken prisoner by the Russians. There are pictures of these troops being taken into captivity by the Russians. So there we go. That was something that Group of Forces North is not telling us so much about. They're not mentioning the fact, for some reason, that this large number of Ukrainian soldiers was taken prisoner in one place. Anyway, that's what Group of Forces North tells us about the situation in the north towards Korenovo. And then they go on to say, the enemy continues to try to break through our defences north and south of Suja. Now, this is becoming a very strange situation because the Russians continue to imply, or insist even, that they still have forces inside Suja. The Ukrainians, of course, deny it, and we've now had Western journalists, Italian and British journalists, travel and go to Suja, which seems, from their accounts, to be securely under Ukrainian control. So perhaps, probably, the Russians are lying about this, though, again, I can't generally understand why. As Suja is a very small place, why would the Russians want to pretend that Suja is still under, or at least partly under their control? If it is not, there might be an explanation. Suja is a fairly dispersed village, or rather small town. The area that is referred to by some as the Suja metropolitan area consists of a number of dispersed blocks and with a river apparently running through them. And it may be that the Russians are in control of some of these blocks to the east of Suja, but that the central main metropolitan area, the places where the journalists have been taken to, is firmly under Ukrainian control. But anyway, I just mentioned the fact that on this topic, the Russians are being, well, shall we say, economical with the truth, at the very least. And they go on to say this. In the north, the Ukrainians attacked the settlements of Cherkaskoye, Porechnoye, and Malaya Loknya twice a day, but were unsuccessful and were thrown back. Now, that again suggests that the two villages of Ruskaya, Porechnoye, and Cherkaskoye, Porechnoye, are under Russian control. Now, there's again been pictures released of Ukrainian troops fighting in this area and in the village of Martinovka, but it is not inconsistent. The fact that we've seen Ukrainian soldiers fighting there is not inconsistent with the Russian account. They're talking about Ukrainian attacks on these villages. It's likely that the Ukrainians occasionally get through, and there are encounter battles, and that they're forced back. More intriguing is what Group of Forces North say about Malaya Loknya, because virtually every mapping project says that Malaya Loknya is under Ukrainian control. Except Redovka, Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, said 2 days ago that the Russians have recaptured Malaya Loknya. And this report by Group of Forces North appears to me to corroborate that claim. Now, that then in turn begs some questions, because the Ukrainians have now released film of the Ukrainians carrying out FPV and ambush attacks on Russian forces close to Malaya Loknya. It's been speculated that this film dates from the early hours of the Ukrainian advance into Kursk region. Well, it might do, but it might confirm that these Russian reports that Malaya Loknya is now actually under Russian control are true. In which case, it's likely, as I said, that Malaya Loknya, Cherkaskoye, Porechnoye, Martinovka, and Ruskaya Porechnoye remain under Russian control, and that the Russians perhaps are starting to build up forces there. Just saying. Anyway, I'm not going to get into the details of this, as I suspect that both sides are being economical with the truth. The Russians about Suja, the Ukrainians about advances in other places. Anyway, then the Group of Forces North then goes on to say, since yesterday we have been fighting fiercely in the areas of Ulanki and Cherkaskaya Konopelka. These are located to the southwest of Suja, destroying superior forces of the Ukrainian armed forces. No breakthrough has been made in this area, and enemy losses are being clarified. So, the Group of Forces North suggests that the entire area around Suja, the whole battle under Suja, is basically under control, that the Ukrainians are not failing to make any further advances at all. And a short time ago, at the Alaudinov, the Akhmat Special Forces commander, verbally said the same thing, that the Ukrainians have made no further advances anywhere in the area where his forces operate, and these are precisely the locations which are covered by this report by Group of Forces North. Now, having said that, Group of Forces North then goes on to say something else, which is actually quite interesting. This is their overall statements about the overall military situation in Kursk region. In 10 days of the Ukrainian Armed Forces invasion of the Kursk region, we have significantly reduced the enemy's grouping, which has already withdrawn many battalions from the 22nd Separate Mechanized Brigade. By the way, the platoon that surrounded en masse appears to come from the 22nd Mechanized Brigade, 61st Separate Mechanized Brigade, and 82nd Separate Airborne Brigade. The 82nd Separate Airborne Brigade is the brigade that operates the Challenger 2s, and there are some reports that a second Challenger 2 has been destroyed in this area. Anyway, the battalions from these forces have been withdrawn to replenish their losses. And Group of Forces North then goes on to say, it is worth noting the effective work of the special forces, which have destroyed Ukrainian armed forces sabotage and reconnaissance groups of 6 militant Ukrainian soldiers. In other words, in Belgorod area, enemy reconnaissance group was probably looking for possible routes to break through the border and weak points in our defences, but in the end, they turned out to be the weak points. And then they finish with the quote from the former Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, victory will be ours. And now they've started giving quotes from all sorts of people. It was Churchill before, now it's Clausewitz. War is the realm of danger. Courage is the most important quality of war. Anyway, so that's what Group of Forces North tells us. A situation where the Ukrainians are being held basically in a ring that extends from Korenovo in the north to Suja in the southeast, with the Ukrainians making attempts to try to break through, but not having any success in doing so. And the Group of Forces North has again given us a list of a number of losses that the Ukrainians have had. But before I turn to that, they also provide with an update about what's going on in the Volchansk area. They say that in Volchansk, fighting continues. In the area of the multi-story buildings, our assault forces destroyed an enemy group from the 57th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade and captured the entrance of an apartment building. So they continue to clear the apartment buildings in the area of the high-story buildings. In the Staritsa area, another village, by the way, which many mappers claim is under Ukrainian control, but which Group of Forces North suggests is actually under Russian control. In the Staritsa area, an attempt to advance by an enemy assault group was thwarted. Up to 7 Ukrainian soldiers were destroyed. And in the Lipsy area, we advanced into the Summer Cottage village area north of Lipsy and have occupied several private houses. The Russians have resumed an attack towards Lipsy. Apparently Lipsy is on a hill and overlooks Kharkiv. If the Russians can capture Lipsy, they can systematically shell Kharkiv city with their artillery, which they were doing for a certain period in 2022. And then they say that over the past 24 hours, the enemy's losses amounted to 400 people, including up to 310 in the Sumy direction, which of course includes Kursk. And they also claim to have destroyed up to 7 tanks in the Kursk and Sumy direction. Well, we'll come to that shortly. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry, as it always does, then goes on to provide its own account, which is very similar, but not identical, to the account provided by Group of Forces North. It says that the armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to repel the Ukrainian attempt to invade the territory of the Russian Federation. Units of Group of Forces North, supported by Army aviation and artillery strikes, conduct reconnaissance search actions to locate and eliminate the enemy's sabotage and reconnaissance groups in forest belts, attempting to get to the depths of Russian territory to the south of Alexeyevsk, Safonovka and Septuhovka. And again, I haven't been able to locate all of these villages or settlements. Some of them are tiny. But I get the sense that the Ukrainians continue to try to send reconnaissance groups northwards. The area where the Russians are intercepting them is moving southwards. I may be wrong about this, but there it is. And then they give a little more information about the Ukrainian attacks that Group of Forces North talked about. Attacks launched by assault detachments of the Ukrainian 22nd, 61st and 115th Mechanized Brigades and the 82nd Air Assault Brigade towards Komarovka, Olgovka, Ruskoye and Cherkasskoye, Porechnoye were repelled. Ukrainian losses amounted to 1 tank, 5 armoured vehicles, 1 counter-obstacle vehicle and more than 30 Ukrainian troops. Aviation and artillery strikes, along with actions of defending troops, inflicted losses on Ukrainian manpower and hardware clusters near Borki, Fanasayevka, Cherkasskaya Konopielka, Novoivanovka, Mikhailovka, Snagast, and to the south of Kurilovka. So this again tells us where the Ukrainian forces are located. And if you look at the map, they're fairly close to the border areas. And then they say that one US-made M270 multiple launch rocket system launcher was destroyed by a missile strike near Bezdrik. Now this is similar to a HIMARS launcher, and it launches the same missiles as the HIMARS launches, and it can also launch, by the way, as the HIMARS can, ATACMS missiles if the right module is deployed. So this is another vehicle. It's a tracked vehicle, unlike the wheeled HIMARS launch vehicles. But again, the Russians claim that they've destroyed another. Ukraine does not have a significant number of these systems. And then the Russians go on to say operational tactical aviation delivered strikes at the enemy's reserves, ammunition, and oil depots of the Ukrainian 22nd Mechanized Brigade, 80th Air Assault Brigade, 103rd, 107th, and brigades near Atinskoye, Belopolye, Vorozhba, Kiyanitsa, Kozitska, and Shalgino. And then they give a list of the total number of losses that the Ukrainians have suffered over the last 24 hours. The Ukrainians' losses have amounted to more than 300 troops, which corresponds with what Group of Forces North say. 27 units of hardware, including 6 tanks. Group of Forces North said 7. The Defence Ministry says only 6. Hardly makes much of a difference. 1 infantry fighting vehicle, 2 armoured personnel carriers, 18 armoured personnel carriers, 18 armoured fighting vehicles, 4 motor vehicles, 1 multiple launch rocket system, 2 units of engineering vehicles, including 1 counter-obstacle vehicle. And they then go on to say, since the beginning of hostilities in Kursk region, Ukrainian losses have amounted to 3,460 troops, that's killed and wounded, 50 tanks, 25 infantry fighting vehicles, 45 armoured personnel carriers, 262 armoured fighting vehicles, 115 motor vehicles, 5 surface-to-air missile launchers, 7 multiple launch rocket systems, including 3 HIMARS and 1 M270 multiple launch rocket system, 25 field artillery guns, 4 electronic warfare stations. So that's what Group of Forces North and the Russian Ministry of Defense are telling us. Now there is a gap, there is a silence in what they say, because again, if you follow other news, you will know that the Ukrainians have been busy destroying various bridges along the Snem River in places like Glushkovo, in the area of Glushkovo, which again is in this area of southern Kursk region. And, well, the Russian Defense Ministry and Group of Forces North say absolutely nothing about this. Now, there were lots of reports yesterday, and indeed the day before, that the Ukrainians are preparing a major advance into this area of Russia, Kursk region, and that the attacks on the bridges were somehow connected with all of this, both to stop civilian evacuations and to prevent Russian reinforcements from arriving. I spoke about how the Russians are busy building pontoon bridges along the Snaim River. But Group of Forces North and the Russian Defense Ministry have told us that no actual Ukrainian advance into this territory has yet taken place. And by the way, I've noticed that there's been no reports from any Ukrainian source or neutral source of any Ukrainian attack in this area either. It's been suggested that the Russians are prepared to withdraw all of their forces to the north bank of this river, ceding control of the border territory to the Ukrainians until their main forces arrive. And who knows? It could be that that is the Russian plan. It could be that the Ukrainians are indeed planning to advance into this territory. From what I can see, we are still talking about small villages, empty villages in this area. It could be that the Ukrainians are thinking of occupying this territory in order to launch more attacks towards Korenovo and Risk from this direction? Who's to say? This is a tantalizing area of the Kursk operation. I've seen it suggested in the Russian media that this would be the last throw that the Ukrainians can make in the Kursk direction, because around Sudzha, their offensive now gives every indication of stagnating. It's not making progress, and the Ukrainians are suffering heavy losses. Now, that's not just my view. There's a long article in The Guardian yesterday by Dr. Jack Watling of the Royal United Services Institute. And, well, he speaks, he wants to give an optimistic spin to the Ukrainian operation, but he's clearly far from confident about its long-term outcome. Firstly, he talks straightforwardly about he acknowledges the steady Russian advance in Donbass. He then goes on to say that the Kursk operation is politically significant. A parallel series of Ukrainian strikes targeting Russian airfields is more militarily advantageous, but we've seen that so far that has not really achieved very much. And then he goes on to admit there is a limit to how successful Ukraine can be. It was suffering from a shortage of troops to rotate and hold the line prior to its operation in Kursk. Now it has pulled together what was available as an operational reserve and committed it to a new axis. It's a point Brian Beletic, by the way, has made, that the Ukrainians were overstretched right across the front lines, which is why they're losing ground in places like Bakrovsk and Toretsk and Chasiv Yar and other places, and they've only made their situation worse by extending their line even further. And he then goes on to say, this is Jack Watling, there is a limit to how far this force can push before it overextends, meaning it will need to dig in soon if the Ukrainians are to hold the ground until negotiations. But as soon as the front stops being dynamic, the Russians will dig defences. They're already doing that. I've discussed that in previous programs, and bring up artillery, electronic warfare complexes, and fresh troops. And they're doing all of those things all the time. He then says, in the short term, the operation has diverted the weight of Russian air-delivered bombs away from Donbass. That has been a claim several people have made. I have seen, again, no actual confirmation of this. But then he goes on to say this will be temporary. Russia has enough personnel and equipment to fight both fronts. It is less clear that this is true for Ukraine. The military risks build with time. Having committed its operational reserve, Ukraine will struggle to plug gaps in the line, and it has not yet managed to resolve the threat posed by Russian reconnaissance drones, glide bombs, artillery, electronic warfare, and operational tactical missile complexes. Collectively, these capabilities are allowing Russia to continue a steady advance to Покровsk, Toretsk, and other towns in Donbass. These towns will soon be depopulated and defending them will be resource intensive. And then he says that the best case scenario for Ukraine is that its units dig in and Russia feels compelled to retake the ground, suffers inordinate losses trying to push the Ukrainians back. However, it is also possible that stretching of Ukrainian resources will increase opportunities for the Russians to find seams in Ukraine's defences and make advances elsewhere. If the latter dynamic unfolds, then it is not clear that the seized terrain will carry much weight in negotiations, as Vladimir Putin will be quite willing to absorb the losses to remove the issue from the talks. Of course, the other problem is that the Russians are now saying that they're not even prepared to negotiate with the Ukrainians at all. And then Dr. Watling admits that the other long-term challenge, and again I'm quoting from him, posed by Ukraine's operation is the equipment that is being lost. And he says that a Trump presidency will probably force Ukraine into negotiations. A Harris victory would see the likely continuation of military technical assistance from Ukraine. Even so, there are limited reserves of equipment. Ukraine could have been building units for larger scale offensives next year, but this operation means critical vehicles and personnel necessary for such an offensive will probably be committed prematurely. The operation, therefore, limits future options. Well, there we are. We see that Dr. Watling clearly has doubts, and he ends by saying that the immediate news from Kursk may have caused optimism that should not distract Ukraine's partners from helping to stabilize the broader front, but he doesn't explain how that can be done. And in fact, there are reports that Germany, having decided to provide some more funding for Ukraine and an extra equipment package, has now basically signalled that further assistance to Ukraine from Germany's budget, which is in deficit, is no longer possible. That apparently has been decided by German Finance Minister Lindner. We see Zelensky bitterly complaining about the British no longer providing as much assistance as they did. It's not clear what assistance the British can provide over and above what they have provided, given the state of their own armed forces. And in the United States, we've had lots of reports now which all suggest that the United States is close to reaching the end of what it can realistically do. What Ukraine has done is not only has it deployed its reserves prematurely in an operation which began with an attack to seize the Kursk nuclear power station, which failed, but which is now degenerating into a battle for villages on the Russian border, which are of no use and importance, a fact which noticed Dr. Watling comments about. What it has done is precisely what my source, who I've been discussing many times, has said. It's given the Russians a wonderful opportunity to conduct further attrition of Ukraine's last reserves. In fact, there's been more reports that apparently have appeared in the Western media, all of which say essentially the same thing, that Ukraine, in this operation, is burning up its last major reserve of trained forces, even at the time when everything else on the battlefronts is going wrong, and when the Russians are close to achieving decisive breakthroughs. Well, there it is. As I said earlier in the programme, the Ukrainians do things that I don't understand the logic of. Perhaps there is some further logic in this Kursk operation, which escapes me. And by the way, Dr. Watling, we'll have to wait and see. In the meantime, the Russians are giving further signs that they think that they have the situation in Kursk under control and that they're very confident about the overall state of the war. Today, Vladimir Putin, far from staying in Moscow, overseeing the situation on the battlefronts, apparently feels confident enough, considers that the situation is secure enough so that he can now proceed and go to Azerbaijan on a state visit. Visit is important in itself. It tells us a great deal about the shift in Azerbaijan's orientation. About 10 years ago, it was hostile to Moscow. It was involved in a regional grouping cobbled together by the Americans, which was called Guam, Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Moldova. Georgia, well, there's a political crisis there, so maybe we shouldn't prejudge things. Ukraine, well, we see what the situation there is. Moldova, well, that has, for the moment, a pro-Western government, which, for the moment at least, appears to be securely in control. But Azerbaijan gives every indication of going over to the Russian side. There appear to be very good relations now between Putin and President Aliyev, Azerbaijan's leader. So anyway, he's off to Azerbaijan. He's clearly not so worried about the situation on the battlefronts. And perhaps even more remarkably, I'm receiving some reports that the Russians are not even calling back trained men who were given furlough for the August holiday. Apparently there are still tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of Russian troops, veteran fighters, who are still on furlough across Russia because the situation in Kursk is felt to be under control. Supposedly they will be returning from furlough in the autumn, September, when of course the situation, when that happens, along the entire Kursk Sumy area might change radically. Maybe not coincidentally, there are lots of reports now of very, very heavy Russian bombing of Sumy itself. And by the way, going back to Dr. Watling said about the Russians having been forced to divert their bomb attacks to other places. There are reports that the Russians are now have started the bombing of Mirnograd, the eastern suburb of Mercouris as well. There's even a photograph which appears to show the detonation from the dropping of a Fab 500 bomb. Anyway, there we are. That is the situation today, as far as I can tell, in this conflict. The Ukrainians are still in Kursk, but the doubts are there. I suspect that they're probably growing. And, well, if over the next couple of days we start to get very dramatic news from places like Toretsk and perhaps Pakrovsk, or more probably Selidovo, those doubts will grow still more. And I suspect that before long, in Ukraine itself, questions will be further asked. I read somewhere, I can't remember where, an article by a Western journalist who says that though there has been a brief fillip in morale on the part of Ukrainian soldiers in Donbass, one only has to scratch below the surface and find that many Ukrainian soldiers are in fact actually very skeptical about the Kursk operation and are complaining that even whilst the adventure in Kursk continues, their situation is going from bad to worse. So, we'll see what happens. Now, yesterday, I mentioned at the end of my program that there has been reports in the Israeli media. In fact, there's not even reports. There's no doubt about this. That the Foreign Minister of Israel, Mr. Katz, after speaking to the French and British foreign ministers, says that France and Britain have committed themselves to participating in an Israeli aerial offensive against Iran if Iran attacks Israel. I've said that this report was then retracted by the Israeli Foreign Ministry. There's been nothing about it said, so far as I know, in either Britain or France. What one can say is that the Russian government has now invited President Pezeshkian to Moscow, President Pezeshkian of Iran, to Moscow for talks. So we will see what happens in the Middle East. The situation there appears to be quiet. I think many, certainly I, think it is the quiet before the storm. My own sense is that the storm there is gathering. We don't yet know when it will break. I get the sense there that the battle lines are being drawn there too. But further discussion of that is for another day. In the meantime, let me finish this program by reminding you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can check out our shop also, where you can find all sorts of amazing things, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.